accepts, essentially concede that Iran does have control of the Strait of Hormuz and he's not going to get any concessions on the nuclear side, or escalate in a very, very dangerous and risky way in the hope that he can achieve the kind of military victory that he hasn't been able to achieve so far.
Well, let's find out more about the reactions back in the United States to what President Trump has been saying at NATO and indeed to those renewed US strikes in the Gulf tonight. We can talk now to Gerry Baker, Times columnist and co-host of the State of It USA podcast. Good evening to you, Gerry.
Hello, Carole.
Good to have you with us. President Trump was very outspoken in his criticism of the Iranian leadership. He then said that he thought the ceasefire with Iran was over. And it looks as though US forces are indeed carrying out more attacks tonight. How do you think this is going to go down back in the US?
Well, look, I think there's going to be first of all, a certain amount of skepticism about whether this really represents a return to war. The war was never popular here. It's the only war in the last 50 years since opinion polling began, really, that Americans have resolutely opposed from day one. So Trump was kind of obliged to bring it to an end when he did. Now, in the process, of course, he enraged some of his own supporters by doing that because the primary condition that seemed to be the end of that war was leaving Iran in control of the Strait of Hormuz, and yet also putting off for another day any deal that would actually do something about Iran's nuclear capability. So, so President Trump faces mixed political pressure here. On the one hand, most Americans do not want this war to resume. They're alarmed about the prospect of what it would do to the economy. They don't want to see higher oil prices. We're getting closer to the midterm elections. Obviously, we're only a little more than 3 months away from the midterm elections, which will be very important. If there's more domestic economic repercussions as the US escalates again, that could turn out very badly for Trump. On the other hand, he's got the sort of hawkish wing of his own party who are furious with the way the war ended. Look, I think the way, everything I hear, everything I'm told today is that this is, once again, this mini escalation that we're seeing here is a kind of Trump seeing the need to retaliate against some of the strikes that have been going on, trying perhaps to impose some sort of US demand that Iran stop harassing ships in the Strait of Hormuz, and that it will not be followed by a prolonged continued warfare, a resumption of the kind of warfare that we saw in March, because Trump just doesn't want to do it and doesn't see the case, and sees all the political risks with doing it and doesn't see a way out.
Yeah, and clearly you talked about the economic fallout. I mean, the big thing that seemed to be of causing a huge amount of concern to the US president was, I mean, he could see US gas prices soaring. Of course, that's not at all unpopular at a time when the cost of living is a big issue anyway, isn't it, for Americans? And you've now got these, we had these attacks on shipping. We're having threats from both sides to reimpose blockades in the Strait of Hormuz. And if indeed you do get that vital waterway blocked once again, I mean, that's going to cause further problems for the US president in the United States, isn't it, Gerry?
Yeah, I mean, where we are just underscores, honestly, how reckless and ill-considered the war was. I think we all know by now. I've got it from some of my own sources. It's been widely reported. Trump was persuaded at the start of the war that this would be quick, that the Iranian regime would fall, that at minimum some friendly regime would take place. It would be a kind of a replay of what happened in Venezuela at the start of the year. That, even if Iran's regime, even if the mullahs didn't actually fall, then there'd be some more friendly government willing to do a deal, willing at least to give Trump something of a victory on the nuclear front, and it would all be over pretty quickly. That didn't happen. They did kill, obviously, the leadership, large numbers of the leadership. They did degrade a lot of the Iranian military capability, but the regime fundamentally didn't change. If anything, it's probably got more hardline. They didn't really do anything on their nuclear capability. They haven't given any concessions at all on that, and of course they've ended up controlling the Strait of Hormuz. So Trump is now in this position where he's really only got a couple of the options are. As they tried to do with the memorandum of understanding a month or so ago, to draw a line under this and say, look, we'll both agree to a ceasefire, we'll let shipping resume in the Strait of Hormuz, and we'll sort out the nuclear stuff later. Or to escalate and to go for all-out war, to maybe launch not just missiles and aircraft at Iran, but actually possibly special forces to go and find that nuclear material, more special forces and naval forces to enforce the opening of the Strait of Hormuz. Well, that's just tremendously risky, both militarily and politically, as I said, in a war that's not very popular anyway. So he's stuck, between the classic rock and the hard place, which is essentially concede that Iran does have control of the Strait of Hormuz and he's not going to get any concessions on the nuclear side, or escalate in a very, very dangerous and risky way in the hope that he can achieve the kind of military victory that he hasn't been able to achieve so far. I think so for Trump, he's not doing either of those things. And what he's doing instead are these sort of intermittent, kind of rather desultory attacks every now and then to sort of send a signal that the US can't be messed with, to try and get the Iranians to change what they're doing in the Strait. But it's not really the solution. The one or other of those two solutions, both of them very unsatisfactory, very risky, are the only ways to end this. And Trump is opting for a kind of a middle way, which just suggests a long, prolonged period where these exchanges of fire become sort of more or less routine.
And just finally, Gerry, President Trump went to NATO. He was characteristically pretty critical of some of the NATO allies for not spending enough, for not being sufficiently supportive of the war in Iran and so on. But then he talked about how he'd felt the love from other NATO allies. I mean, they'll probably come away from this relieved that they got off relatively lightly from President Trump.
Yes, it is a slightly kind of characteristic of an abusive relationship, isn't it? Where he goes in and sort of slaps them round the cheek and then sort of tells them how much he actually loves them after all. Look, I do think that your previous guest very rightly said we just don't know from one day to the next whether what Trump says will hold. But I think the most significant thing we saw we saw the usual theatre, right, in Ankara. Trump denouncing many Europeans, saying he didn't want anything to do with Spain anymore, criticizing, European countries for not supporting him in Iran, for not doing enough in their own defense. The usual kind of stuff that we've seen, usual sort of verbal, again, sort of slaps around the chops. The one thing that seems to have been significant, and U.S. officials are talking this up quite significantly, was his meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. Did go well. We're a long way from that awful meeting in the Oval Office 18 months or so ago when Trump first took office. He said very warm things about Zelensky, and indeed, he at least verbally committed to allowing the Ukrainians to essentially to be given the patent and the authority to be able to make their own versions of Patriot missiles. Now that's been one of Zelensky's big asks from the United States. It's not been clear whether Trump would give it, but he's seen obviously what's been going on in Kyiv in the last few days with the huge attacks. He knows that Ukraine desperately needs more of these missiles, and it does look, again, this could change, but it does look as though he's granted Ukraine something that they've been asking for, and that looks like a pretty significant step, which probably will matter much more in the end than all of the verbal kind of back and forth that he gets into with other NATO leaders.
Gerry Baker, Times columnist, co-host of the State of It USA podcast. Always worth a listen. Thank you, Gerry.
Thank you, Carole.